Okay, cool. Um, so today we're talking about Express. We'll get into like what that is, but it's basically like the ultimate server router. So this talk, we're kind of just going to recap HTTP and Node really quick. We'll talk a little about endpoints, what they are, how we can make them, and tools to kind of get pretty good at working with them, as well as middleware. And we'll see all of this in action with a lovely live coding demo again. So HTTP and Node, really quick reminder, HTTP is how we send things across the web. It's the protocol we use, and we're gonna have to follow the rules behind it when we're building these endpoints. So just something to keep in mind. And Node takes JavaScript out of the browser. It lets us do computery things like run a server. Which is what we're about to do. So it's kind of cool. We get to use JavaScript on the browser and as a server. So to build endpoints, everything kind of is based around like Crud Operations, because we store data in a database for persistent storage, which basically means like it stays there after you're done doing whatever. If the server crashes, the data should still be there. It's kind of important that happens for most things we do. So we use CRUD operations to make sure it happens. And endpoints basically perform these. There are 4 of them, CRUD. That's create data, read data, update data, or delete data from the database. And the specifics of like what these are, we're going to cover it next week in our database week. So that's pretty exciting. Express is the main thing we'll be talking about. It's a node package, and we use it to set up endpoints. It acts as a router, as you can kind of see down here. Like, it'll take in an HTTP request with a method and a path that goes into the router, and the routers, it basically puts the code, or it runs specific code. Yeah, so that's like what the Express router does. Oh, and as always, jump in with questions if you have any. I figured out how to open chat this time so I can read that. So with this routing, let's look at some examples. So a little participation this time. So if I was to throw this first HTTP request into the router, do y'all have an idea on which endpoint it would go to? You could type it in chat, say it out loud. Just think in your head if you want. Is it B? Yeah. Yeah, so everyone's saying B, super good job. If you didn't get that, that's completely fine. What we're looking at is what method was used, which we kind of see here. That's a get, post, get, and then what path we're looking for. So the user path. Okay, so now let's try number 2. Where would this HTTP request go? And you can toss that in chat as well. Yeah, awesome job to everyone who said E. So we're looking for a post request this time and in the appointment path. These ... dots are basically code that runs when that path is matched. I didn't want to write code for this example. So whatever's here would be ran and if that request was sent. And then for the last example, does anyone know what would happen if I sent that HTTP request? Okay, so this one, actually nothing would happen, or more specifically, you should return a 404 because it's like, hey, this resource can't be found. So kind of a trick question, but we have to honor that HTTP protocol. and send something back if we can't find what happens. So that's like listening to the protocol. You have to send something back, so we send an error message back. Sorry for the trick question, but yeah. So hopefully y'all have an understanding of like how the router works. Under the hood, you don't really need to know, I guess, as long as you understand what it does. So uh, we can pass data to these endpoints using three ways. If we're doing GET requests, we could either put it in the URL, kind of like this. Y'all might have seen this on some websites. It's called a URL query, and it basically says this key ID is equal to blah. And we can get that on our backend by using request.query.id, and we would have it. We can also use URL parameters. These look a little cleaner in my opinion. We basically say like, hey, whatever this thing is, that's actually a variable in the URL. And we could access that with request.params.id. Here's the same example written with a URL parameter, recipe/blah. And those are for GET requests. If we were posting data, we would put it in the body of our request. And y'all might have seen that if you've completed part 2 on the recipe site. Like when you send ratings, you have to put all that info in the body of the request. And we can access that on the back end by using middleware. Some helpful tools we have while developing these endpoints. There's this node package called nodemon, which makes running node pretty fun, honestly. Like it automatically reloads the server every time you save a file, which is much nicer than having to manually like stop it and restart it. Super good for development. And there's also this tool called Postman, which lets you send HTTP requests from your computer. You don't need a website to post data or get data. You can do it from this client. And this really highlights like the front end and back end logic are separate. You could develop a whole suite of APIs without ever touching the front end. So I think with that, we can actually hop into our demo time. Were there any questions about how the router works or like what Express does?
How does it highlight the difference between front end and back end again?
Okay, yeah. So you could develop APIs just on a server, and all you would really see is like certain data pop back at you. It wouldn't look pretty at all, but the backend would kind of just be processing data, getting it from the database. And you could make a front end client, and we'll do this in week 5, that just calls API endpoints to get that data and present it nicely.
Cool, thank you.
Awesome, sweet. Oh yeah, quick note before the demo. Congrats on making it over halfway through boot camp. Super proud of y'all. Okay, so for the demo, we'll be coding kind of some basic endpoints just so we get a feel of how they work. I kind of lost my chat, so hopefully someone can jump in if someone has a chat. But yeah, I guess let's get started. So we're using Node. So the first thing we'll want to do is initialize our Node project. And that just gives us a package.json, as we can see here. And we're actually going to add something to it to get our server running pretty easily, a little dev tag. And when I say npm run dev, we want it to run nodemon.index.js, which we'll be making later. So that's our package JSON. We now have a little script running in it. So we can save that. And because this is all about Express, we'll want to install Express. Okay, cool. So to start, we're just going to set up the absolute basics of an Express server. We'll import Express like that, and we'll create an app that just kind of initializes Express. And then we'll tell the app to listen on port 3000. So this is kind of telling the computer like, hey, port 3000, this app is going to use that. So anything that kind of happens on that port, do something using this app we're building now. And with that, we can actually come in here and run our server, and y'all can see we started something. If we try and load the site, I don't know if y'all can read that URL, but it's just localhost on port 3000. We'll get a cannot get kind of like the index file. And that happens because it doesn't really know where to look. So we'll add that really quick. We'll say app, which is our Express app. And then when we do a GET request to the home or the index location, we're going to run a little function that looks something like this. And we'll send hello world. So to kind of walk through this, we're saying app.get. So when I do a GET request, at this path, run this function. And that's using arrow notation. Express kind of has it built in to where it passes the request and a response kind of variable when it runs this function, or when this path and method are matched. And then that gets used to kind of run all the code inside the function. So if we save that, ooh, crashed our server. Oh, missing a little parenthesis. Okay, cool. So when we save that, we now have a hello world using a server this time. So when we go to localhost 3000, we're actually running this little snippet of code and getting our hello world back. Always the most fun program to write, in my opinion. It's not super interesting though. Like, I'm sure your mom would be proud, but like there might be more you want to do. So we'll take in using kind of that query URL querying, we can take in a name. So if we wanted to go to like hello name equals Ethan, and we want it to say hello, I guess like let's add an endpoint that does that really quick. So we're going to do another GET request at hello. Same kind of deal with request and response. And we'll actually have to set a name variable because we need to grab it from the URL. And we do that with the request.query because it's a URL query. And then name. And then with that, we can send a response code and an actual little message. So hello, name, exclamation point. And hopefully that will actually get us hello, Ethan. Yeah. So now like we could use hello, Eric as well. We could put whatever we want in that name. This doesn't, oh, I guess first off, does anyone know what the 200 code does?
It just checks to make sure that the server is receiving properly, right?
Yeah. So when the server sends a 200 code back, that just means like, hey, everything worked perfect. This is exactly what should have happened. This isn't a perfect little function though, because like, what if there's no name? That's not really right. So got to honor that HTTP, like that protocol, and we'll send an error message back if something bad happens. And this can get done with some if statements. So like if name is undefined or there is no name, we can send back a status code of 400, which means like this response, it's kind of bad. Yeah, that's 400 code. There's a whole list of all of these. You don't really have to memorize them. And then we'll just say like error, no name, sad face. And so now if we try and run this, we get an error because we didn't provide a name. So this is kind of it's a pretty solid endpoint we just set up. It does error checking and it says hi if you give it a name. So that's kind of a super basic one. If we wanted to change it from a URL query to a URL parameter, we could actually come up here and say in the path, take in a name and change this to params. And that will actually look up here if y'all can see the URL. And kind of take it as a whole path like that. I really do think it just looks cleaner. It kind of treats that argument as a variable in the URL. And you could chain a bunch of these together. And that's pretty nice if you're wanting like specific pages to have specific URLs. So like my Twitter account has its own URL. It's not like a ID equals my username. It's just like twitter.com/my username. So that's kind of like how Twitter accomplishes it. I don't know if they use Express, but I mean, if you were building a mock site, this is how you could do it. So that's kind of a super basic start. And we'll go back to the slides and look at something we can add to this kind of logic. There's this thing called middleware, and it's kind of code that runs between when we get the HTTP request and when we actually run a certain function. Some uses of this is like if I want to log who's accessing which resource, if I want to authenticate users, or just kind of like make sure people aren't abusing my API, I could add something right in here before the router takes over that kind of like it just runs before the rest of your code does. So for our example, we're gonna kind of log our traffic. So it'll look like a timestamp of when someone accesses a page. It's not a super great example, but it does show the point. And we'll do that up here since we want it to run before all of our other code gets processed. So that would look like an app.use, and then that just takes in a function. So request, a response, and also something called next, which Express kind of treats as like, hey, when I call next, just move on to the next endpoint. And we need that, otherwise we'll kind of just hang on that function and not move on. So with that, we want to actually build our function. And we would add a timestamp field to our request. And this lets us add information to the request and use it in other endpoints if we wanted to. And we could just say new date there. And then we'll log that timestamp like so. And then we'll say, okay, you can move on now. So if we save that, and y'all look down here, hopefully you can see the server window. When we go to a page, it kind of logs like what time that happened. And it's kind of in a cryptic format, but I mean, that's today. That was the exact time I loaded the page. If I do it again, it'll just keep like logging the time. So that's running before any other endpoint kind of gets processed. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, that flow of things. Okay, I'm assuming it does. We can also serve up static files from our server. So it's not just something to take in a request and spit something back out. Sometimes we want like images or even whole web pages to be served from our server. So we could do that. I kind of set up a little image file or folder. Okay, hopefully, yeah, so now we have a couple images. So let's hop back into our code, and we want to somehow get those from this web page. And that can be done by, Express has a static file server kind of built in. So we'll be using that to serve these images. And that'll look like an app.use images. And then there's built-in function called static. And that's the folder where my images are. And I think that should be enough. This kind of looks like middleware. It just like runs this code when I go to images. So if I go to images and then Chef Sean, which is a file in the actual folder, we can't get it. Why would that be? Does anybody see something? We could try and fix it if not. Okay, let's see if it's a GET request. I hope it is. Otherwise, okay. I don't want to spend too much time looking at this. It might be the path, hopefully. Okay, you can serve images. I don't want to keep trying to debug in front of y'all. It is a little stressful, not gonna lie. Okay, got lucky. So yeah, we're serving an image from our URL. That's me and Sean. It's a cake, we're chefs. Kind of a random picture I have, but we're doing that from our server now, instead of just like telling the browser to look for a certain file on the computer. For the most part, when we're setting up a backend, we won't use it to serve files for the front end. We're going to be using React for our front end, and that kind of has its own routing stuff set up. We'll be using our backend for setting up endpoints that the front end can call to get data. That relationship will become much more clear once we get to React, but it kind of has the same feel as using the fetch API. Like you're just calling a server to get data back. Yeah, and speaking of that API, we're gonna kind of jump now into how that looks from a server point of view. So we're gonna hop on Postman now, which is that tool I was talking about. It lets us get, or just make GET and POST requests pretty easily. Instead of having to use a browser, we could just like punch it in here and run it much quicker. Just to show y'all like kind of how it works, we'll make a GET request at our URL, and if we send it, we get our hello Ethan or hello whatever name back. So that's how a POST request would look. It should also work with images. Yeah, I mean, it's a big image, but there it is. Yeah, but to deal with actual POST requests, y'all may have noticed like you put stuff in the body and you send the body of the post request to the server and the server deals with that. Hopefully that sounds familiar. If not, that's kind of how you do post requests. But we need to access this info somehow. So to do that, we actually have to install another package called body parser. And as the name says, it kind of parses the body. We're going to restart the server because the settings file kind of got changed, the package file. But now we should have the ability to parse the body. Just have to make a couple tweaks. So first off, we'll add a body parser, or like we'll kind of take that package and say, hey, we want to use it in our code. And we would do that with a required statement. And then we would add some middleware that the body parser gives us. And that looks like this, bodyparser.json, which is saying like, hey, when you get a request, take whatever's in the body, which looks pretty jumbled normally, convert it to JSON and replace it. So when we do that, we now have JSON that we can access pretty easily within these functions we're building. And then to actually like use that code or use whatever we get in the body, we'll come down here and we'll say, hey, when we make a post request to a rate URL, same old thing with a request and a response. And let's see how we deal with that. I guess for this example, let's just log whatever is getting passed in through the body. So we're passing in our food and our rating for it. Kind of similar to what y'all are doing on the recipe site, although this time it's looking on the back end. So all we have to do to kind of get that from the body is say request.body and then .food and request.body .rating. And then that'll log it down here to the server. And then we just send a response back saying, yep, everything went fine. That should be status. And then we send rating posted. Cool, cool. And now with that, we can actually send this post request and boom, we got a rating. We got it on the server side and we got our response back to Postman. And Postman's super great for these post requests because otherwise you kind of have to set up a HTML form to send post requests or use the command line to do it. And the command line, kind of a scary place. So we have this nice user interface we can use for all that. So this is kind of a overview of how we can use Express to set up our own endpoints, serve images, deal with get and post requests. And these examples are all really like kind of basic. For most of the cases we'll use Express for, we'll be dealing with a database. And we'll talk about how like to talk to a database from our server on the back end next week. But for now, we're just trying to set up a way to take in a request and do something with it. So are there any questions about kind of all of that I just went through?
Can you show us again how you set up the server with Node?
Yeah. So the server, it's kind of just a node process that's running. So let's see. All I'm doing is saying node index.js or nodemon. And that kind of just runs index.js. And because there's no like termination of the file, it kind of keeps that server running. If that makes sense.
So Node is kind of saying like interpret this JavaScript file as a server.
Yeah. And it kind of just sits there waiting for a request and spitting stuff back out when it gets one.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Any questions about the requests or using Express? Okay, awesome. And y'all can always message me. Oh, Ben, no, I don't want to use curl. It's too verbose while typing. Rather just click a button. Just personal opinion. Okay. Yeah, so that's kind of setting up our endpoints. So, like, what are you gonna do with this? I'm trying to keep this task kind of short, just because I still feel like really bad for overloading y'all. Major apologies for that. So, this next week, or I guess weekend, if you can, you'll install Node and Postman. That shouldn't take too long. Let me know if you have questions about it. And you'll also set up some endpoints. So you'll kind of get a look on the backside of running a full stack web app. So you're going to set up kind of the outline of endpoints to like get a recipe, get all the recipes and get a random recipe, as well as posting ratings and creating kind of a shopping cart of all the recipes you have. Like you'll be able to add recipes to that shopping cart. Kind of the end goal of this project is to be able to add your recipes, compile a shopping list of all the ingredients you need, and like be able to shop with it if you have good recipes. But like detailed specs of setting these endpoints up will come soon. And I mean like pretty detailed, just because I know this is foreign for the most part. So I want it to be familiar. Yeah, and that's all I have about Express. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. I know that did kind of go fast, maybe. So